times you want to have a curved piece for a project you're working on, there are other methods other than laminating thin strips. Steam bending, cutting from a solid stock, or kerf bending are three other methods. But tonight's program is on laminating thin strips. There are many places where curved pieces of wood are needed, some of which are in furniture parts such as chair backs and stretchers, or architectural parts, musical instruments, and bows for archery use. The side walls of musical instruments are a good example for curved wood applications. This demaloon table is an example of where a curved piece of wood may be used in furniture application. Here's another demaloon table. The bent wood here goes all the way around the face of the apron in this application. The form has an equal role with the actual workpiece in bent laminations. Both come from your design, and both have to be considered in your design process. This is a form and the actual work pieces prior to forming for the sides of a dulcimer. We'll use this in our program. From your design, you'll derive a process for building your form and making your workpiece. The form is composed of creating a pattern diagram, bandsawing the pattern, shaping the pattern board, cutting out the parts, assembling the form, and finally a cleanup and finish. The workpiece follows the process of preparing your wood four square with the edges and sides square with each other, then resawing from that workpiece the strips that you're going to use, and either then sanding them to thickness or planing them to thickness depending on what equipment you may have. Then you apply the glue, press them together, and then you let them cure. In vacuum pressing, we normally use a one-part form, but the form must be very solid. I like to use MDF and keep in the back of my mind that I'm going to be applying 14.7 psi atmospheric pressure on every square inch of the workpiece as it presses down on the form. Concentrating more on the workpiece. The workpiece can use a wide variety of woods, but my advice is to avoid using oily woods because they don't hold glue well. As we've said before, you're going to mill your workpiece four square and get the sides and edges perpendicular before you start your resawing activity. You're going to resaw to a heavier thickness than what you want for a final thickness because you want to be able to sand these things to a nice consistent thickness and smooth finish. Of course, your design is going to be dictated by the application you're using. After all, a chair back is a chair back. But you do have to keep some things in mind. There are some limitations on both the workpiece and on the form, and that is that you have to be able to extract the workpiece from the form once it's been pressed. Your laminations have to be thinned enough to bend. Straight grain is preferred, and you need to avoid all sharp transitions. The form has to be able to withstand 14.7 psi and be able to allow you to extract your workpiece. Let's look now at developing the form. The form used for this bent laminate procedure is itself made up of laminated MDF pieces. In this case, I'm using 1-inch thick MDF stair treads. The pattern is bandsawed in 1/2-inch MDF and finished with sandpaper to fair the curves. It'll become part of the form after it's used for forming the other pieces. The individual pieces of the form are first cut out on the bandsaw and then formed using the pattern and a top bearing pattern following bit on the router table. After all the parts are routed, they're then assembled along with the pattern into the final form. We then clean it up and give it a coat of polyurethane varnish. Before each use, we'll apply a fresh coat of wax. The wax and varnish will together protect the form from glue. The 3 steps of working with the workpiece are first to mill the lumber 4 square, resaw the strips, and then sand the strips to thickness. We need to remember in milling the workpiece that the length needs to have a little overlap on each end of the form. The thickness depends on the number of strips you're going to have and the kerf width of your saw and your planing operation. And keep in mind the sides are square with the edges. The internal laminations can be secondary wood as long as it's bendable. It can even be bendable plywood. Just remember to keep them thin and usually less than 1/8 of an inch, thinner if possible. And they need to be continuous from end to end. In this program we're going to do 2 work pieces. One very thin lamination for the sides of a dulcimer and the other one for another demolone table, and that'll be thicker laminations and a little more severe bend. Now let's look at this resawing operation. Remember that the workpiece has to overlap both ends of the form and it has to be 4 square. Make it thick enough so that you get all your laminations out of it. It's important in resawing to start with a 4 square workpiece. Edges and sides should be perpendicular to one another and dead flat. I use a feather board with a backstop to make sure that the bottom of my workpiece is pushed against the fence to make sure that I'm cutting the bottom. I can watch the top, but I can't watch the bottom. The 3-tooth hook configuration on that blade allows me to move very briskly. However, it does leave a rough surface on the cut, but that's alright because I'm going to sand it all off later in the thicknessing step. It's important to plane the cut edge between saw cuts to give yourself a good bearing surface for the next cut series. Since your workpiece has gotten thinner by the cutoff that you've made in the planing sequence, you now have to reset your feather boards. Rather than fussing with blade drift and a fixed fence, I use a point fence precisely set to the width of the wood that I want cut off of the workpiece, and just steer the wood through to keep that at a consistent rate, and I can move right along without worrying about blade drift or tension. I use a drum sander to thickness and sand smooth my laminations. You could use a planer or even a plane, but it may be a little bit more difficult. The bandsaw leaves rough surfaces on your resawed strips, so it's necessary to sand them smooth and at the same time get them to uniform thickness. So this step is designed to do just that. We use double-sided tape to stick the strips down with the good side down and the rough side up so that we can run them through the drum sander. Remember that these strips are going to be very thin when you get finished sanding them. They're going to be less than the 1/16 of an inch. So you have to use just a small piece of this double-sided tape so that you don't end up cracking your strip taking it off. Your strategy here is to use several very light passes on your sander, not one deep one. You need to avoid putting too much stress on these thin strips. The press itself is made up of a vacuum bag, a pump, a table, and a base plate. Vacuum pressing requires a good solid table. In this case, I'm using a 4x8 sheet of plywood over my assembly table. The vacuum pump is a simple vane type vacuum pump that just runs the whole time that you're pulling your vacuum. My base plate is a 3/4 inch thick piece of melamine with 1/8 inch deep saw curves at 3-inch intervals in both directions. The grid work leaves air ducts for the air to be pulled out of the form. Now let's look at some vacuum pressing. If I do that though, this appears to be a four-handed operation. It can be done with two, but definitely two people working at this at the same time is a great help. This We're using polyurethane glue because it doesn't creep. While Doyle is putting on glue on one surface, I was spraying the other surface with water, and these are very thin strips, so they immediately started to curl. We have a little strip of masking tape on each end there that will fold over to hold these things together while we put them into the form. I'll ultimately come back do a thicker one to show people how the thicker ones are different. Look at that thing curl. I don't like using polyurethane glue, but in this kind of thing, the polyurethane glue doesn't creep.
Is that right?
And that yellow stuff, you saw that demonstration down there at Colco that time, when a guy showing it how it creeped.
Yeah, it'll scoot around on you for sure. There's no doubt about that.
Just throw that down there.
I'm gonna go on here with this one. look at the bow on there.
I'm trusting that that'll come out of there when we
Oh, I bet it
get
will.
under that pressure.
I bet it will. Now let's see. Got that side up there.
Pull this out of here and throw it aside. Just get it square on there. Make sure there aren't any wrinkles in there as we come across. Put it underneath. Wait a minute. Sure I kept my gloves on, I guess.
Okay, I got this. You do that.
I need to push this down a little further. It's pretty mobile actually in there. We're doing some last minute positioning and pressing down on the critical points to make sure that it closes at the right place, and the vacuum will start to take hold real soon now, and we won't have to worry about holding it anymore. In fact, we won't be able to do any moving at all once it does. We're doing last minute checks now. If we find something we don't like, we can always turn off the vacuum and reposition it and turn the vacuum back on. The polyurethane is a relatively slow curing glue, so it gives you a little flexibility in this operation. We're checking the time now. We'll have to give this 45 minutes to an hour to dry with the vacuum on before we open it up and see our results. Nothing to do here but wait. Now we're going to look at the more challenging end of it. We're going to use thicker laminations, a tighter bending radius, more challenging form, and at the same time we're going to work alone. This form is a full half of an ellipse, so it goes from vertical to vertical across the elliptical shape. A little bit more challenging than the dulcimer side. Note the break in the outside surface here where the inner layers were not continuous strips. I kind of knew this was going to happen, but I went ahead with it anyway. The glue up sequence for thicker strips is no different than the other. Wet one side, put the polyurethane glue on the other and spread it evenly. Make sure you cover all spots. In this sequence I'm handling it all on my own, so it got quite a bit more hectic doing it this way than it would be if I'd had someone else to hold things down for me, but it is doable, just a little bit more of a strain. The other thing that's a strain here is that this form is much higher than the other form, and thus when it pulls up you have to make sure that the bag doesn't get caught between the workpiece and the form, which it did in this case. I had to redo it 2 or 3 times, but I finally got it to where it would pull down. There was a discontinuity between my top of my workpiece and the laminations underneath, and it cracked at this point. In this particular case, since I don't need those ends, I can just cut this off and it's okay, but you have to keep this in mind as you go along. In summary, we have to acknowledge that our design needs to accommodate the application, but it also drives both the form and the workpiece design. So you need to take that into consideration. The form itself needs to be very robust to accommodate the pressure that's going to be put on it by the vacuum bag. Your workpiece has to start out 4 square in order to enable you to do a decent job of resawing. Laminations need to be thin to enable bending. Use a glue that won't creep after it's dried. Polyurethane is a good choice for this. And finally, use your judgment on getting help. A little bit of help goes a long way in doing this. It usually takes more than 2 hands to get the job done. I hope this helps. If not, please get in touch with me and I'll try to help you out however I can with this. It's not a complicated thing. It takes a little bit of equipment and some patience, but I don't think it takes any great amount of skill. I think we can all do it.
Sweethearts from days of our childhood, memories of songs fill the air, flowers we picked in the wildwood without any worry or care. Same old mill, same old stream where we used to sit and dream. That's just why I think of you, sweet Nellie Dean. In my dreams you wander still down the lane beside the mill, as we did in days gone by, sweet Nellie Dean. How could I ever doubt you? Why did I let you go? I know my love for you is just the same. Same old stream, same old mill, same old sweetheart waiting still. That's why I still think of you, sweet Nellie Dean. Yeah, that's why I still think of you, sweet Nellie Dean.